find his daughter's killer. And John Ramsey joins me now live. John, it's good to have you on the show again. Thanks for being here. I thought of you. Listen, today, immediately, I thought about you when the judge in the Long Island serial killing case said, okay, whole genome sequencing, it's in. So what was your reaction to that?
Well, I had to study it a little bit to understand. I've been pushing forensic genetic genealogy research in our case for a while. And basically, it requires a different set of data than has been put into CODIS, which is the federal database. CODIS has 15 or 20 markers. If you match the markers, you're the bad guy. If you don't, you're out. There's no way to research genealogy and track this genealogy research program with that data. You've got to have this new data taken, new samples taken. And what has happened so far with these cases where old cold cases have been solved is they've used this technique of genome sampling and then built a family tree using usually the mother side of the family. And they go back and create a family tree going back X number of years, depending on how old the case is. And then they look who the relatives were. And in the first case that this was solved was a Golden State Killer case in California, and it was a 40-year-old case, cold case. Well, they found this guy that was a relative in the town where this crime was committed 40 years ago. Then they went and got his DNA, and the DNA matched the sample they have. And so, bingo, they found the killer. So it's a huge advance, and I believe it's the way our case will be solved. I think it's a really good chance it could be solved if it's implemented. I learned recently that yes, you can get this data from a hair sample. We have several hair samples from Jonbenet's crime scene that weren't identified. We donated hair and pubic hair. There's a pubic hair sample in Jonbenet's blanket, not linked to anybody at this point. We know you can get a sample from that now. I've heard that before, and of course heard it in your program. So it's a huge tool to identify killers.
When investigators later revisited the testimony of Linda Hoffmann Pugh, the family's housekeeper, they realized her words carried more weight than many first assumed. She was not a casual outsider. She moved through the Ramsey home daily, cleaned their rooms, handled their laundry, and noticed the habits that others overlooked. So when she described a blanket wrapped around Jonbenet, possibly pulled from her bed, or even lifted from a washing machine near her room, that detail mattered. It was a snapshot of how a household object could instantly become part of a cover-up. A soft covering taken in haste could bear traces of whoever handled it. If fibers belonged to John or Patsy, that alone would not be surprising, they lived there. But if authorities someday confirmed a DNA match tied directly to Burke, the implications would shift dramatically. What had once been dismissed as background contamination would transform into direct involvement. Linda also knew what lay in the basement. She had been in that space many times, arranging boxes, dusting corners, and she understood what was stored down there: rope, art supplies, the broken pieces of a paintbrush. These were not mysterious intruder tools, they were part of the family's inventory. The idea that a stranger crept in carrying nothing, but then conveniently discovered materials to assemble a restraint feels less plausible when weighed against her observations. If the fibers of that brush carried Burke's touch, it could be explained as the natural result of a child fiddling with household items. Yet in this context it would strengthen a scenario of improvisation after an accident, not a calculated break-in. The broken basement window further fueled this line of reasoning. Linda confirmed it had been damaged long before the night of the crime. That simple fact dismantled the dramatic imagery of a stealthy figure crawling inside under cover of darkness. Instead, the unrepaired frame became another reminder of negligence, but not evidence of forced entry. Eliminating the fantasy of an intruder only sharpened the focus back onto the occupants. The violent blow to the skull and the subsequent binding were never likely the work of someone unfamiliar with the house. They were carried out within walls where people already knew the layout, the switches, the blind spots. In a broader narrative, Linda's testimony highlights the domestic setting not as a fortress breach where panic unfolded. A child possibly injured during late-night conflict, an older sibling present, parents confronted with chaos, and a scramble to conceal. A blanket seized from a familiar spot, a rope lifted from storage, a brush snapped to form the crude handle of a ligature. Each item ordinary in isolation yet together, under her recollection, they create a map pointing inward. Forensic science may someday finalize whether DNA connects those items back to Burke. But even without that ultimate confirmation, the housekeeper's memory strips away the veil of mystery. She reminds us the basement was not a stranger's lair, but a family's storage room. The broken window was not a secret passage, but neglected maintenance. And the blanket was not foreign evidence, but part of the household fabric. That context shifts the lens entirely, not toward the unknown, but toward the people already inside. Beyond the basement and its objects, Linda's recollections also reached into the everyday rhythm of the Ramsey household. She noticed what most outsiders would never glimpse at. Patsy tried to manage her daughter's routines. Night after night, Jonbenet struggled with bedwetting. Sheets had to be stripped, clothes replaced, mattresses wiped. Linda herself helped with the endless cycle of laundry. That pattern meant one simple thing: Patsy's touch was constantly on the child's clothing. If technicians ever confirmed genetic material from Patsy on garments, it would not automatically suggest sinister action. It could easily stem from the repeated handling during late-night cleanups. But in the broader chain of evidence, it reinforced the picture of a mother stressed, exhausted, and deeply entangled in her daughter's private struggles. At the same time, Linda observed something darker between the siblings. She recounted moments when Burke displayed resentment toward his little sister, leaving messes in her room, even smearing feces on her belongings. These acts went far beyond childish mischief. They suggested jealousy, frustration, and rivalry bubbling beneath the surface. If, at some point, Burke's DNA surfaced on critical evidence, investigators could no longer dismiss it as random household transfer. It would line up with a history of antagonism. A clash between children might ignite suddenly, fueled by anger, with devastating consequences. And if an impulsive act left Jonbenet fatally injured, the family's next steps could explain why everyday items from the home were repurposed to stage an entirely different scenario. Linda also overheard Patsy's private frustrations. She spoke of arguments, tension over John's long hours, and the strain of maintaining appearances. The Ramsey house looked polished from the outside, yet inside, stress ran high. A mother coping with a demanding social calendar, a daughter with recurring accidents, and a son showing troubling behaviors, all while a husband remained frequently absent. In that pressure cooker environment, the probability of a domestic accident spiraling into tragedy became more conceivable. When investigators later weighed possibilities, Linda's testimony illuminated the context: not a break-in by a faceless predator, but a family already under strain where one flashpoint could collapse the entire facade. Consider how these strands connect. A blanket hurriedly pulled to cover her, rope and brush fragments from the basement, and now, the overlay of family dynamics, nightly stress, childhood jealousy, marital tension. Each piece alone might be brushed aside. But together, they reveal a household far from tranquil. If Burke's DNA were someday verified on pivotal evidence, the history of conflict would lend it chilling significance. If Patsy's genetic trace appeared, the routine of tending to a daughter's accidents would provide explanation, but it would also underscore her physical proximity in the critical hours. The portrait that emerges is not of a house invaded, but of a home already crumbling from within. Linda's voice, quiet but precise, strips away the illusion. She didn't speculate wildly. She described what she cleaned, what she heard, what she witnessed. And those ordinary details, when connected to forensic possibilities, map out a chain of pressure, rivalry, and concealed desperation. It is in that tension between the polished exterior and the messy interior that the true weight of her testimony lies. Another thread from Linda Hoffmann Pugh's account involved the most infamous artifact of the case, the ransom letter. She had first-hand knowledge of what paper and pens were kept inside the Ramsey home. She remembered where notepads were stored, which writing instruments were left in the kitchen, which drawers Patsy tended to use. When investigators later realized that the lengthy letter was drafted on paper belonging to the household, Linda's recollections gave it context. It was not a random coincidence. It tied the message directly to the family's own supplies. Her suspicion pointed quietly toward Patsy. Linda had watched Patsy handle stationery many times, preparing party invitations, jotting reminders, writing lists for errands. The loops, the flourishes, the way letters leaned, all familiar to her. If in the future laboratory analysis confirmed Patsy's DNA on that ransom note, the weight of Linda's memory would grow. It would not merely be a scientific finding. It would connect back to an eyewitness who had long suspected that the mother's hand shaped those words. In a case riddled with speculation, that alignment between testimony and potential biological trace would stand out sharply. Linda also knew the family's collection of everyday items that, in hindsight, took on sinister significance. Rope stored for household tasks. A broken brush handle from craft supplies. These were not foreign objects planted by an intruder. They were domestic tools within easy reach. If scientists matched genetic material from Burke or John to those items, it could be explained by casual handling during ordinary family life. Yet in the framework of a cover-up, such matches would gain a different meaning. It would suggest that the very implements of staging were not carried in from outside but chosen from within, touched by familiar hands well before that night. For a prosecutor, this convergence matters. Picture the chain: a child injured in a sudden outburst, a mother desperate to deflect suspicion, a father aware of the stakes. A note drafted hastily, using house stationery. Language designed to point police toward a fictitious kidnapper. Objects pulled from storage to construct a false scene. None of it requires an intruder, all of it can be traced to what Linda already cataloged in her years of service to the household. Her role was not to guess but to recall, and she did so with precision. Think of the atmosphere this creates. On one side, a meticulously staged script, a long ransom demand, dramatic wording, threats never intended to be carried out. On the other, the mundane reality of a housekeeper who knew which pad the note came from, who had seen Patsy use that very pen. When viewed through Linda's eyes, the elaborate letter reads less like a mystery and more like the desperate act of someone inside, trying to control the narrative before daylight arrived. Her testimony bridges the forensic with the domestic. It draws a direct line between a handwritten note and the family's own supplies. It places everyday tools at the center of a staged story. And it reminds us again, what outsiders imagined as the work of an intruder, Linda recognized as the ordinary materials of the Ramsey household recast in the darkest way possible. What Linda Hoffmann Pugh heard in the weeks leading up to Christmas offered another layer of insight into the family dynamic. She had spoken with Patsy about a personal loan of $2,000. Patsy promised she would provide it, but that conversation later became ammunition for suspicion. When investigators searched for motives, some wondered if the housekeeper had been resentful, if money might explain a violent act. Yet in the framework of the DNA hypothesis, that angle begins to collapse. If future results tied the crucial evidence back to family members, the idea of Linda as a financially desperate outsider fades. What remains instead is her testimony as an observer, not a suspect. Her memories also captured lighter exchanges that, in hindsight, took on darker meaning. Patsy chatted about the coming holidays, about the family's travel plans to Michigan, about parties and decorations. She painted a picture of a busy household straining under the weight of appearances. To Linda, those details seemed ordinary at the time. But when the tragedy struck, those conversations sharpened the contrast of family presenting festivity to the world while turmoil simmered inside. That contrast underscores how a staged ransom plot could grow out of desperation, not out of any external threat. Equally striking were Linda's recollections of the children's interactions. She had overheard disputes between Burke and his sister, the bickering that often slid into genuine conflict. These were not harmless tiffs, they revealed tension, envy, and sparks of hostility. When prosecutors later examined the possibility of a sibling confrontation spiraling into disaster, Linda's words aligned perfectly. She had already described quarrels, irritation, and the imbalance between them. If laboratory tests ever tied Burke's genetic trace to the items involved, Linda's testimony would not be a coincidence, it would be corroboration of long-observed rivalry. Taken together, her conversations before the crime framed a household marked by money discussions, strained travel schedules, and children clashing in ways that could not be brushed aside. If DNA one day confirmed internal involvement, the supposed motive of a housekeeper needing cash would vanish like smoke. What would remain is the image of a mother stretched thin, a father distracted, a daughter burdened by constant demands, and a son wrestling with jealousy. And after the crime, Linda heard more snippets of worry, of Patsy's attempts to explain the unexplainable. These fragments may not have been intended as confessions, but they illuminated pressure points. A mother concerned about appearances, a family preparing to leave town, siblings caught in yet another spat. In a vacuum, each is trivial. Combined, they outline a stage where panic could explode and lead to choices that reshaped every object in that house into evidence. For those seeking clarity decades later, Linda's recollections strip away speculation. They show that talk of money was not a motive but a distraction. They show that holiday plans were not innocent but pressure. And they show that quarrels between children were not random but part of a pattern. Viewed through this lens, her testimony becomes not the voice of a suspect, but the record of a witness who heard the fracture lines forming long before the night everything collapsed. After the crime, investigators pressed Linda Hoffmann Pugh on one of the most sensitive questions, had she ever seen signs of mistreatment inside the Ramsey home? She answered with candor. No, she had not personally witnessed acts of cruelty. Yet she admitted harboring suspicions, especially about Patsy's behavior. Those doubts were not accusations but impressions formed over years of observing a mother who was often overwhelmed, sometimes volatile, and occasionally harsh in tone. If forensic testing one day confirmed Patsy's genetic trace on critical evidence, Linda's guarded comments would take on amplified weight. Her instinct that something was off would suddenly appear prophetic, not speculative. She also reminded detectives of Burke's disturbing conduct, the soiling of his sister's room, the smears that shocked even a seasoned housekeeper. That detail, small as it seemed, reinforced the portrait of a family struggling with deeper dysfunction. These were not merely childish pranks. They hinted at resentment and instability under the surface. If Burke's biological material later matched items tied to the staging, Linda's earlier observations would serve as corroboration, not coincidence. The pattern of troubling behavior she described would converge with hard science, painting a picture of a household far from stable. The complexity deepened when Linda was summoned before a grand jury. She testified in detail, recounting what she had cleaned, what she had heard, what she had suspected. But she was bound by secrecy rules, barred from speaking publicly about the content of her testimony. That restriction muffled her voice in the broader debate. To the public, her silence fueled speculation. Yet imagine if those transcripts released alongside definitive DNA findings. Her words, preserved under oath, could align seamlessly with laboratory results, strengthening the theory that the truth lay not with an intruder but within the family itself. What emerges is a stark contrast. On the one hand, officials once floated Linda herself as a suspect, citing her financial need and her access to the home. On the other, her sworn statements actually pointed in the opposite direction. She was the one describing Patsy's stress, Burke's troubling acts, and the strained atmosphere after the holidays. Rather than evidence of her guilt, these insights became evidence of what she saw unraveling inside the house. If DNA findings eventually land on family members, Linda's testimony would not only be vindicated but elevated as an essential puzzle piece. Think of how this narrative fits together. Before the crime, she overheard money concerns and children quarreling. During the investigation, she identified ordinary household objects that later became evidence. Afterward, she provided impressions of stress, suspicion, and dysfunction, then was silenced by grand jury rules. Each stage of her involvement adds another layer, not of speculation, but of lived observation. Her account is not dramatic. It is steady, mundane, almost routine. Yet precisely because of that ordinariness, it resonates. If future forensic matches confirm her impressions, the housekeeper once suspected will instead be remembered as the witness who quietly told investigators what they needed to hear all along, that the danger was never outside the walls, but inside. One more thread investigators followed involved the household tools that later appeared linked to Jonbenet's injuries. Each object carried an unspoken question: who actually owned it, who last touched it, and why did it matter? The flashlight found in the kitchen became one of the most scrutinized. It was large, heavy, and capable of inflicting blunt trauma without leaving an external cut. The batteries inside had been wiped clean, erasing smudges that would normally identify users. That detail alone suggested deliberate handling. This was no foreign object carried into the house. It belonged to the Ramsey family. Linda Hoffmann Pugh had seen that very flashlight before, resting on counters, used when the power flickered. If forensics one day matched traces on it to someone inside, the mystery of the initial blow would shift sharply away from the idea of an unknown intruder and squarely onto the people already living there. The knife found near the basement was another unsettling detail. It had been described as a household utensil, possibly part of Burke's playthings or Patsy's kitchen supplies. Some experts speculated it might have been used to shape wood fragments, crafting the crude handle later tied to the restraint. Its origin was not exotic. It was not a burglar's tool. It was something Linda herself could recall among the everyday items of the house. If DNA connected Burke or blade, it could be dismissed as ordinary use. Yet within the staging theory, it provided a practical explanation. Whoever orchestrated the scene did not bring equipment from outside. They simply reached for what was already within reach. Then came the model train tracks. Investigators considered whether the marks on Jonbenet's body aligned with the edges of those miniature rails. Burke owned the train set. Linda had seen him with it countless times, playing, dismantling, reassembling. The possibility that those rails caused certain patterned injuries was chilling. If true, it meant the instruments of harm were not improvised by a stranger, but emerged from a child's toy. And if Burke's biological trace was confirmed on those pieces, the explanation could never be brushed aside as contamination. It would tie the narrative back to a domestic accident escalating into catastrophe. What all these items share is origin. None were foreign. None pointed to a prowler carrying a toolkit into the home. They were already in the Ramsey household: the flashlight for emergencies, the knife from the kitchen, the train set from a child's playroom. Ownership rested with the family, not with outsiders. That fact carries immense weight. It strips away the plausibility of a faceless intruder improvising with uncanny precision. Instead, it reinforces what Linda and others had long described: a family surrounded by ordinary objects that, under sudden stress, became instruments of tragedy. In the larger arc of this case, the significance of ownership cannot be overstated. If laboratory analysis eventually proves family DNA on these items, then every theory built on outside intrusion collapses. The story would no longer be about a shadow slipping through a broken window. It would be about a household turning in on itself, where toys, utensils, and flashlights were transformed into silent witnesses of what really happened that night. According to Linda Hoffmann Pugh, none of the debated implements came from outside. She told investigators clearly the flashlight belonged to the Ramseys. She had seen it many times, sitting in the kitchen, used during outages or when John walked through the house at night. It was heavy, practical, part of the family's belongings. When questions arose about how such an object could have delivered a crushing blow, Linda's knowledge of its ownership mattered. It was not foreign, it was theirs. If smears of DNA someday confirmed use by a family member, her recollection would anchor that discovery firmly in the category of domestic possession. She also recognized the knife. To Linda, it was not mysterious. It came from the kitchen, where she cleaned and organized daily. She recalled seeing Burke with a small blade used for his crafts and play. She also remembered the household knives Patsy kept near the pantry. The tool discovered near the basement did not surprise her. It was simply another item she had cataloged in her routine work. That meant if forensic testing linked it back to John, Patsy, or Burke, the explanation would not require a break-in. It would point instead to something chosen from the home itself. The toy train set was unmistakably Burke's. Linda had dusted it, put pieces back in their box, watched him run cars along the tracks. When experts suggested that odd marks on Jonbenet's body resembled edges of those miniature rails, Linda's testimony gave context. This was not a stranger's weapon. It was a child's toy set, owned by the brother, used in his playroom. Ownership in this case carried more than sentimental value. It raised the possibility that what was designed for amusement became, under sudden rage, an instrument leaving patterned wounds. And then there was the brush handle. Linda described art supplies kept in the basement: paints, sticks, craft materials. The broken fragment recovered there aligned with objects she had seen regularly. It was not introduced by someone sneaking in. It was sourced from the family's own storage. If biological traces linked that piece to a Ramsey, Linda's testimony about its origin forced the conclusion that the staging drew exclusively on household property. Taken together, her statements reveal a simple truth. Every contested item, the flashlight, the knife, the toy tracks, the brush fragments, belonged to the Ramseys. They were in daily circulation, observed by Linda in her cleaning duties, familiar to every member of the family. That ownership destroys the romanticized picture of an intruder improvising with uncanny luck. Instead, it highlights a chillingly practical explanation. Whoever constructed the false narrative that night did not need to bring tools. They simply reached for what was already there. Linda's testimony about possession becomes critical when combined with potential DNA results. If family members' genetic profiles appear on these objects, it will not be a surprise. It will be the logical extension of what Linda had said all along. The instruments of harm were not brought in. They were part of the household, silently waiting until panic turned them into evidence. When John spoke to investigators and later to interviewers, his statements about the evidence often drifted into the implausible. He told one version of the story about going out for dinner, putting the children to bed, and then simply assuming an intruder entered unseen. In another exchange years later, confronted with the pineapple evidence, his answer veered toward fantasy. He suggested Santa Claus. That wasn't a slip of memory, that was an attempt to plant distance between his family and the most tangible clue on the kitchen counter. When the prime suspect in his mind became Santa rather than someone in the house, it said more about deflection than clarity. Now weigh that against the housekeeper's voice. Linda Hoffmann Pugh described not just what she saw but what she knew intimately, where knives were stored, who played with them, who left wood shavings scattered. She recounted Burke walking through the house with his red Swiss Army knife, cutting wood, leaving debris she had to clean. She grew so frustrated that she confiscated the knife and tucked it in a cupboard near Jonbenet's room. That was weeks before the murder. And yet, after the crime, that same knife turned up in the basement, closed to the victim. Linda said plainly, no outsider could have known where she hid it. Only someone inside that family. So which rings truer? John's wandering explanation, Santa Claus, intruder fantasies, vague memories of a quiet night, or Linda's grounded account, rooted in daily experience of that home. The contrast is stark. A father who, when faced with inconvenient evidence, defaulted to improbable stories. A housekeeper who, under oath, repeated the same details consistently, even when they cast suspicion on the very people who once employed her. It becomes even sharper when you consider the nylon cord. Investigators knew it was cut, likely with a sharp blade. The red knife fit that function perfectly. Yet John avoided mentioning the knife, avoiding acknowledging that his son's habits might connect to those cut marks. Instead, he floated Santa Claus. That wasn't ignorance. That was strategy. John minimized, redirected, and sometimes invented alternative explanations when evidence threatened the family. Linda, in contrast, gave detectives the kind of ordinary observations that later proved crucial: ownership of the flashlight, the origin of the knife, the placement of the toy train, the art supplies in the basement. Her words matched the physical record. John's often clashed with it, so are his statements about the evidence credible? The record suggests otherwise. They sound like protective maneuvers, not honest recollections. Linda's testimony, often overshadowed in documentaries, emerges as far more reliable. She didn't need to spin myths about Santa Claus. She pointed to the cupboard, the toys, the ordinary objects in that house. And in doing so, she exposed the distance between what John said happened and what the evidence truly showed. Why does Linda Hoffmann Pugh matter so much in this story? Because she wasn't just another acquaintance of the Ramsey family, she was inside that house almost every day. She knew its layout, its quirks, its storage spots better than most relatives. That makes her voice different from neighbors, reporters, or even police who visited only after the crime. Linda's perspective came from routine, from folding laundry, from cleaning the corners, from being present when the family let their guard down. In a case built on contested objects, a blanket, a rope, a pen and pad, her knowledge of ownership and placement became invaluable. Consider the blanket found around Jonbenet. Linda had handled that bedding countless times. She knew which ones belonged on her bed, which were stored near the laundry, which carried Patsy's scent from nightly washing after accidents. If DNA analysis one day confirmed traces from family members, Linda's testimony would provide the context. These weren't random fibers, they were part of everyday life. And that turns the narrative away from a faceless trespasser toward the far more troubling possibility of staging from within. The rope stored in the basement told a similar story. For years, speculation painted it as something carried in by an intruder. But Linda could describe exactly where cords and strings were kept, what they were used for, and who had access. If forensic work ever linked those fibers to Burke or John, her testimony would not only support the match but also eliminate the idea that such materials were alien to the house. She'd seen them there long before December 25, 1996. Then there was the stationery, the paper and pen used to write the long ransom letter. Police confirmed it came from the house itself. But Linda could go further. She knew which drawer Patsy favored, how she wrote notes, where lists were left. If her account matched DNA findings pointing to Patsy's biological trace on that document, it would do more than identify a suspect. It would show how the very tools of deception were pulled from within the household, right under the eyes of the woman who cleaned those same spaces. This is why Linda became so significant. She wasn't speculating about strangers. She was recalling where she put things, where she found things, and who she saw using them. In a courtroom, that transforms abstract forensic data into a lived narrative. A swab showing Patsy's DNA on the ransom note is one thing. But pairing that with a housekeeper testifying that she knew exactly which pad it came from, that's something a jury can picture. Her role isn't about accusing directly. It's about grounding. She strips the case of its exotic theories and brings it back to reality, household items, ordinary chores, familiar patterns. And in a mystery defined by confusion and contradiction, that grounding is precisely what makes her such a powerful potential witness. If justice is ever revisited with modern science, Linda's testimony may well be remembered as the quiet, but decisive voice that tied the evidence back to where it truly belonged, inside the Ramsey home. The intimacy of Linda Hoffmann Pugh's observations set her apart from every other witness. She didn't just clean the Ramsey house, she witnessed its private rhythms. She saw Jonbenet's recurring bedwetting. She stripped sheets, replaced pajamas, and ran laundry late into the night. That cycle of accidents revealed stress and exhaustion within the family. But more importantly, it created a pattern of constant parental involvement. If laboratory analysis ever tied Burke's DNA to garments or bedding, Linda's memories would give it weight. She knew the accidents weren't rare. They were chronic. And that meant both children, and often Patsy, were directly connected to those items on the night of the tragedy. Even more unsettling was what she recalled about Burke. She described the disturbing behavior of smearing feces in his sister's room. This wasn't a one-off prank, it was a repeated sign of resentment, maybe even hostility. For Linda, it was both shocking and exhausting, another mess to clean. Another reminder that sibling dynamics in that household weren't just bickering but potentially aggressive. If investigators someday confirmed Burke's biological trace on evidence linked to the crime, these earlier incidents would no longer appear as childish mischief. They would look like precursors, early signs of jealousy that boiled over. And in the framework of a sudden conflict between brother and sister, Linda's recollections provide a plausible foundation for the BDI theory. This is where Patsy's role becomes critical. Linda long suspected that the ransom note reflected Patsy's handwriting style. She had seen her write lists, invitations, reminders at times to recognize familiar loops and slants. In the aftermath of the crime, the idea that such a letter originated from inside the house, on paper taken from their own supply, fit perfectly with what Linda already knew. And if Patsy indeed authored that document, it wasn't to point suspicion at herself. It was to shield her son. The implication is chilling. A mother crafting an elaborate deception not to cover her own guilt, but to protect a child who may have lashed out in the heat of rivalry. The synergy between these pieces is powerful. Jonbenet's bedwetting episodes created stress and kept Patsy tethered to nightly routines. Burke's smearing episodes highlighted resentment and conflict. The ransom note, likely in Patsy's hand, suggested a desperate attempt to control the narrative once a fatal outcome could no longer be hidden. If DNA results one day solidify Burke's presence on incriminating items, the path from childhood frustration to catastrophic accident to maternal cover-up will seem almost linear. Linda's testimony weaves these threads into coherence. She wasn't theorizing about strangers slipping in through windows. She was describing the daily life she cleaned up after: the accidents, the resentment, the handwriting, the ordinary supplies. And because she was close enough to see those details, her role became decisive. If forensic science confirms her observations, then her testimony will not only support the staging hypothesis but also explain the emotional core of the tragedy: a jealous brother, a desperate mother, and a cover story that fooled the world for nearly 3 decades. When Linda Hoffmann Pugh was summoned before the grand jury, her testimony carried weight that few outside the courtroom have ever fully appreciated. Bound by secrecy rules, she could not disclose publicly the specific questions she faced or the exact words she gave. But those who understand her prior statements know the focus fell most heavily on the relationship between Patsy and Jonbenet. Prosecutors want to know not just about the holiday decorations or daily routines, but about tension, discipline, and the strain of constant bedwetting episodes. Linda had been the one stripping the sheets, handling the soiled clothing, and witnessing Patsy's frustration up close. In that chamber, her role was to connect those intimate observations with a timeline that investigators believed might explain the tragedy. What makes her sealed testimony so critical is the possibility that it contained references linking household objects to DNA traces that could not be fully processed with 1990s technology. Today, with advances in touch DNA and probabilistic genotyping, those same references could become far more significant. Imagine if her closed-door account detailed which blanket was used, which drawers contained writing pads, or which items Patsy handled most often. If modern testing later revealed Patsy's biological imprint on those same objects, her sworn words would suddenly become corroborating evidence of staging, not mere housekeeping chatter. The emphasis on Patsy also mattered for another reason. Linda had long suspected the ransom note bore hallmarks of Patsy's style. Inside the jury room, she would have been pressed on how certain she was, what comparisons she had seen, and how often she watched Patsy write. If she testified that the letter mirrored patterns she knew well, and if a future DNA result one day tied Patsy to that document, the synergy would be undeniable. Handwriting familiarity plus biological confirmation. That dual-track visual recognition and scientific proof could collapse the defense, and an outsider penned the note. And then there was Jonbenet herself. Linda had spent countless hours around the child, noting her vulnerabilities, her health quirks, her reliance on her mother. She could describe how Patsy managed those vulnerabilities, sometimes with tenderness, sometimes with visible exasperation. In a grand jury setting, such details were not gossip, they were context. They painted a portrait of a relationship that may have been under stress at precisely the moment when an accident or confrontation spiraled. If a DNA match later confirmed family involvement, those human details delivered under oath would give jurors a framework to understand motive and behavior. The frustrating reality is that her testimony remains locked away, shielded from public review. Yet its potential is enormous. If ever unsealed, it might align seamlessly with modern forensic findings, strengthening the theory that what happened in that house was not an act of invasion but a desperation. Linda's grand jury testimony, focused squarely on Patsy and Jonbenet, may one day prove to be the missing bridge between science and story, between numbers on a lab sheet and the lived reality of a family collapsing under its own secrets. One of Linda Hoffmann Pugh's most specific contributions as a witness came from what she knew about the crime scene itself. She told investigators that the blanket covering Jonbenet did not appear out of nowhere. To her eye, it looked like one taken from the child's own bed, or possibly retrieved from the washing machine sitting just steps away from her room. This seemingly minor observation becomes critical when placed alongside the possibility of future DNA results, if laboratory work ever confirms John or Patsy's genetic material embedded in that blanket. Linda's account provides the missing explanation of how and why it was there. It would not just be the residue of living in the same home, it would point toward deliberate handling at the moment of concealment. The washing machine detail matters even more. Linda had managed the Ramsey laundry countless times. She knew the cycle: wet bedding from Jonbenet's accidents, clothes thrown in hastily, blankets spun and dried late at night. In her testimony, she suggested the covering found around the body may have been freshly pulled from that very spot. That fact, if paired with DM profiles of John or Patsy, would strongly suggest not random transfer but active participation in staging. After all, an intruder would have had no reason to know where a blanket was stored, much less to pull one directly from the washer. Only someone familiar with the house's routines could make that choice. Consider the logic: a child is fatally injured, panic ensues, and parents face the unthinkable exposure, scandal, the loss of everything. In that moment, the impulse to cover her body with something familiar, something soft, becomes both practical and symbolic. Yet in forensic terms, it is disastrous. Every hand that touched that blanket left behind biological evidence. If John placed it, his DNA would linger. If Patsy adjusted it, hers would as well. And because Linda had already described exactly where the item came from, her testimony would anchor any laboratory finding into a coherent narrative of concealment. This is why her insight cannot be dismissed. Without her, the blanket is simply a piece of fabric. With her, it becomes a roadmap. It shows that whoever staged the scene did not need to look far, did not need to improvise with foreign objects. They simply walked to the laundry, pulled a cover, and wrapped the child. That decision, small as it may seem, betrays familiarity and intimate knowledge of the home that no intruder could possess. If modern testing one day verifies the presence of John or Patsy's DNA on that blanket, prosecutors will not need to build a story from scratch. Linda has already provided the framework. She placed the object in its rightful location, explained its role in daily life, and pointed to the logical chain that turned it into evidence of a cover-up. Her testimony transforms a blanket from household clutter into a critical exhibit of staging, connecting the dots between domestic routine and deliberate concealment. When investigators revisited the household dynamic through Linda Hoffmann Pugh's eyes, what emerged was not a picture of domestic harmony but one of mounting stress. She described the strain that lived inside the Ramsey home: tension between husband and wife, pressure from social obligations, and most of all, the challenges of raising two very different children under one roof. Patsy carried the burden of maintaining appearances, preparing events, and managing a daughter with recurring nighttime issues. John, often consumed by business, seemed distant. That imbalance left Patsy stretched thin, exhausted, and occasionally volatile. It was in that crucible that the seeds of disaster grew. For Linda, the signs were unmistakable. She noticed the ongoing conflicts involving Burke. He was not merely a mischievous boy. She saw acts that crossed into troubling territory, smearing feces in his sister's space, leaving messes deliberately, pushing boundaries that required constant correction. To her, this wasn't just sibling rivalry. It was evidence of jealousy simmering beneath the surface. Combined with the family's ongoing stress, those behaviors suggested a home on edge, not a sanctuary. If, in the future, forensic analysis Burke's DNA to key items from the crime scene, Linda's testimony about these behaviors would frame those findings in a chilling new light. The theory that a sibling clash may have triggered the fatal sequence, the BDI hypothesis, gains strength precisely because of what Linda observed. She described a child who craved attention, who sometimes acted out against his sister, and who was capable of hostility disguised as childish misbehavior. A 9-year-old wandering the house with a Swiss Army knife, whittling wood, leaving shavings behind, only reinforced her sense that he was testing limits. In isolation, such actions could be dismissed as boyish experimentation. But against the backdrop of a sister repeatedly drawing parental focus through medical issues and pageant demands, the resentment could have been combustible. The family tension wasn't limited to the children. Linda recalled Patsy's frustration with John's absence, her complaints about carrying the weight of holiday preparations, her moments of exasperation with both kids. She heard enough to conclude that the marriage itself was strained. That strain magnified the consequences of any late-night confrontation between the children. A sudden accident involving Burke and Jonbenet, in a household already fraying at the edges, could easily lead parents to panic. Their instinct, faced with the prospect of public scandal, might be to shield their son at any cost. This is why Linda's insights into family habits matter. They weren't wild speculations. They were the lived details of a housekeeper immersed in the Ramsey routine, the fatigue, the arguments, the rivalry. If modern DNA testing one day verifies Burke's presence on decisive evidence, Linda's observations will no longer be read as mere background. They will stand as corroboration that the BDI theory was not dreamed up years later, but was foreshadowed by patterns visible to someone who cleaned up the family's daily messes. Among all the artifacts in the Ramsey case, none has drawn more scrutiny than the ransom letter. Its length, its bizarre phrasing, and its origin inside the house make it unlike anything seen in typical abduction scenarios. For Linda Hoffmann Pugh, suspicion always pointed back to Patsy. She had watched Patsy write countless notes, shopping lists, invitations, reminders left on counters. Linda recognized the distinctive loops, the flourishes, the way letters slanted across the page. To her, the letter echoed that style too closely to ignore. The origin of the materials only deepened the suspicion. The paper came from a pad inside the Ramsey home, not carried in by a stranger. The pen matched others Linda had seen Patsy use daily. That fact alone undercut the notion of an outsider staging the scene. An intruder would have had to spend precious time rummaging through drawers, locating supplies, and drafting 3 pages under extreme risk of discovery. But Patsy knew exactly where those items were kept. She had used them in front of Linda many times. If modern DNA testing one day ties Patsy's profile to that note, Linda's testimony will crystallize the explanation. It was written by the mother, not by an invader. The contents of the letter also raise questions that Linda's perspective helps answer. The sum demanded $118,000 was not random, it mirrored John's recent bonus. The language mixed theatrical threats with domestic familiarity, as if the writer knew exactly how to mimic the cadence of a Hollywood script while slipping in references meaningful only to the family. Linda had seen Patsy's flair for drama, her desire to maintain appearances, her tendency to over-elaborate. The note read less like the cold precision of a career criminal and more like the desperate creation of someone trying to control a spiraling situation. If forensic confirmation of Patsy's DNA on that letter ever emerges, the implications would be devastating. It would not just identify her as the author, it would align perfectly with Linda's long-standing suspicions. Patsy would be seen not merely as the mother of a victim, but as the architect of the cover story. The staging would become undeniable. A false kidnapping narrative designed to shield the household from exposure, perhaps to protect Burke from the consequences of an explosive sibling conflict. Linda's role here is not speculation but grounding. She could testify where the pad was stored, how the pens were left on the counter, how often Patsy sat at the table scribbling notes. Her ordinary recollections transform abstract forensic data into a believable narrative. A jury might struggle to weigh DNA results alone, but when paired with a housekeeper's clear memory of who used those tools daily, the story gains power and clarity. The ransom letter is often the longest in American criminal history, but length is not its most important feature. Its true significance lies in origin, and Linda Hoffmann Pugh's familiarity with the Ramsey household means she could help prove that origin was not outside the walls, but at the kitchen counter, under the hand of Patsy Ramsey herself. From the beginning, Linda Hoffmann Pugh's role was clouded by suspicion. Investigators learned she had once asked Patsy for a loan of $2,000. That simple request quickly transformed into rumor, then into a supposed motive. In the eyes of some detectives and in headlines splashed across tabloids, the housekeeper was cast as the jealous outsider resentful, strapped for cash, and therefore capable of violence. For a time, she became an easy scapegoat. Her access to the house, her knowledge of family routines, even her presence during holiday preparations, all of it was turned against her. But when weighed against the forensic record, that theory falters. If one day DNA results confirm what many already suspect, that the decisive traces on key evidence belong to members of the Ramsey family, then Linda's alleged motive dissolves instantly. The accusation that financial desperation drove her into a lethal act becomes implausible, even absurd. Instead of being the perpetrator, she emerges as the witness who first described the very objects later tied to the staging. The shift is dramatic. For years, the idea of a desperate housekeeper lingered in the background. Yet Linda herself consistently pointed inward, toward Patsy's handwriting on the ransom letter, toward Burke's troubling behavior, toward ordinary household items repurposed into instruments of concealment. If biological profiles ultimately match John, Patsy, or Burke, the credibility of Linda's testimony will rise. She will no longer be remembered as the accused, but as the one who tried to warn investigators from the start. This potential reversal lights why her account matters. While John deflected with stories of Santa Claus, While Patsy projected polished appearances, Linda delivered plain details: where the flashlight usually sat, where the paper came from, where the rope was stored. She never claimed to see the act itself. She described the setting and the context that made staging plausible. If the science of 2025 validates her descriptions, her status shifts from suspect to cornerstone witness. The controversy around her also reveals a deeper flaw in the investigation. By focusing suspicion on Linda, authorities may have diverted attention from the family at a critical early stage. Instead of pressing harder on inconsistencies in John's statements or the peculiarities of Patsy's note, energy was spent chasing a theory built on a small loan request. Decades later, that misdirection looks less like diligence and more like a mistake. For a jury, this transformation could be powerful. To hear how a woman once accused of having motive actually offered testimony that aligns with modern DNA evidence would strike a chord. It reframes her not as a shadowy figure on the margins but as the most authentic voice in the case. The person who knew the home intimately, who described its routines, and who was silenced by suspicion when her insight was most needed. If the promised forensic breakthroughs ever arrive, they may not just clear Linda Hoffmann Pugh's name. They may cement her role as the witness whose honesty, once doubted, ultimately illuminated the truth that had been hiding in plain sight. The shadow over Linda Hoffmann Pugh did not end with police suspicion. In 2001, 5 years after the crime, she took the extraordinary step of filing a lawsuit against John and Patsy Ramsey. The reason? Their book The Death of Innocence had implied she was a suspect, planting her firmly in the public imagination as someone capable of killing a child. For Linda, who had already endured police scrutiny, the publication of that book was a second blow. It wasn't just investigators questioning her, it was the victim's own parents, in print, pointing fingers. The case revealed how deeply the family sought to redirect suspicion outward. Rather than confront the inconsistencies in their own statements or the implausibility of the intruder theory, the Ramseys' narrative spotlighted a convenient target, the housekeeper. She was painted as financially needy, embittered, and therefore plausible as a culprit. To Linda, this was defamatory. It wasn't only an attack on her reputation, it was a public attempt to rewrite the story. Her lawsuit argued that by casting her as a potential suspect, the Ramseys deflected attention away from the mounting evidence inside the home. Now imagine how that lawsuit would look if modern DNA results one day confirm a family member's profile on critical evidence. The book's insinuations would no longer appear defensive, they would look like a deliberate distraction. In that light, The Death of Innocence could be read not as grieving parents searching for answers, but as a calculated attempt to mislead, to smear a witness whose testimony pointed inward. Linda's lawsuit, dismissed at the time, might be reconsidered by history as prescient, an effort to resist being used as a decoy. The stakes of that litigation extend beyond Linda's personal vindication. They strike at the credibility of the Ramseys' entire defense. If they were willing to publicly accuse their own employee, someone who knew the house better than anyone, what does that say about their confidence in the intruder narrative? Why target the woman who described the blanket, the rope, the pad of paper, unless her observations were dangerously close to the truth? The lawsuit reminds us that the battle over this case wasn't just fought in police stations and labs, it was waged in the media and the courts, where perception mattered as much as facts. For Linda, the lawsuit was a way to reclaim her name. For observers now, it becomes part of a larger pattern. Whenever evidence or testimony pointed inside the family, energy was spent casting shadows on outsiders. If forensic breakthroughs ultimately prove the family's involvement, then the book that once framed Linda as suspicious will stand as one more layer of misdirection, one more piece of staging, this time on the page than in the basement. In that sense, Linda's lawsuit was not just about defamation. It was about truth. She knew the house, she knew the routines, she knew what the book implied, and she refused to accept the role of scapegoat. History may yet decide that in 2001, when she took the Ramseys to court, Linda was not just defending herself, she was exposing how far the family would go to protect their version of events. When Linda Hoffmann Pugh filed her lawsuit, she accused John and Patsy Ramsey of defamation. The claim was simple. Their book had cast her as a suspect in a murder she did not commit. For Linda, this wasn't speculation, it was a direct attack on her character, one that jeopardized her livelihood and stained her name permanently. She argued that the book implied she was capable of harming a child she had cared for, a suggestion she considered outrageous and malicious. In court, however, the case was dismissed in 2002. The judge ruled that the Ramseys' statements fell short of legal defamation, effectively siding with their right to express suspicion. For Linda, it was a crushing blow. But that dismissal doesn't erase what the lawsuit revealed. It highlighted the fear the Ramseys had of Linda's knowledge. She knew too much about the layout of the house, about the family's habits, about the items later tied to the staging. By casting her as suspicious in their book, the Ramseys shifted the spotlight away from themselves and onto the one person whose testimony could dismantle the intruder theory. Now imagine how differently that lawsuit would be read if forensic science today confirms Patsy or Burke's DNA on decisive evidence. Suddenly, the strategy of pointing at Linda would no longer appear defensive but calculated. It would show a family trying to neutralize a dangerous witness, one who might otherwise give weight to the theory of an internal cover-up. Her lawsuit, though dismissed, would then be seen as a marker of the Ramsey family's anxiety, not about Linda's innocence, but about her potential to expose truths that aligned with the evidence. The context of 2002 also matters. By then, suspicion against the Ramseys was simmering but not resolved. The grand jury had been disbanded, and no indictments were brought. The family was desperate to restore their reputation. Publishing a book that deflected suspicion onto others was part of that campaign, yet targeting Linda specifically speaks volumes. They could have blamed vague outsiders. They could have leaned harder on the fantasy of a prowler. Instead, they singled out the housekeeper. Why? Because she had the credibility of proximity. She was inside the home, she saw the habits, she could testify about where the rope, the pen, the blanket came from. That made her uniquely threatening. If DNA someday nails down Patsy as the writer of the ransom note, or Burke as the source of biological traces on incriminating items, the defamation lawsuit gains new meaning. It becomes evidence of a family trying to silence the most authentic voice in the case. The book would not just be memoir, it would be seen as a strategy part of the same pattern of staging and misdirection. Linda lost her case in court, but history may deliver a different verdict. If science confirms what she always implied, that the danger was inside, not out, then the lawsuit dismissed in 2002 will stand as proof that the Ramseys knew exactly who threatened their story, and why they were willing to sacrifice her reputation to keep their own intact. The lawsuit hurt her, no way around it. Filed in 2001, dismissed in 2002. Headlines translated that loss into a label: unreliable. Bitter employee. Axe to grind. Defense teams love that kind of stamp. She sued in law coming shorthand for not trusting her. Jurors remember it. Reporters repeat it. Over time, the dismissal drags her credibility down a notch every time her name appears. But here's the harder truth. A court tossing a defamation clause in a verdict on what happened in that house. It says almost nothing about whether her observations were accurate. It says those words in a book didn't meet the legal bar for libel. Different questions, different standards. Still, the damage to perception stuck, and perception matters. However, the more dangerous piece for the Ramseys is this: if modern testing locks key items to family DNA, the meaning of that lawsuit flips. The dismissal won't erase what the filing exposed: fear of what Linda knew and could describe under oath. Then the narrative changes from she's unreliable to she was a threat. Why would parents publicly spotlight their housekeeper if her knowledge was trivial? Why aim at the one person who knew where things lived in that home? This isn't the worst of it. The content of her knowledge is not biased. It's proximity, daily access, patterns, routines. She knew which drawer held the pads and pens. She knew how bedding cycled after accidents. She knew which storage zones in the basement kept string, craft sticks, odds and ends that could be turned into a binding device in a panic. She heard the strain in Patsy's voice. She saw Burke's acting out. Those aren't theories. Those are observations. If lab work later ties the note, the blanket, or household tools to family touch, her observations become the backbone that explains how those traces got there. What troubled them most, however, was not the lawsuit they lost, but the way it was handled frames motive to misdirect. A published book hinting at the housekeeper as suspect looks like narrative control. If science points inward, that book reads like a smokescreen. Not proof of guilt, proof of anxiety, consciousness of risk. A preemptive strike on the witness closest to the boring, domestic truth. As a prosecutor, I ask a simple question: who benefits from shrinking her credibility? The outsider theory does. The family does. The staging hypothesis does not. It wants her on the stand. It wants the jury to hear about drawers, laundry, holiday prep, tempers fraying at midnight. It wants a witness who can say, plainly, this pen was on that counter. This pad sat in that slot. Those household items were there before Christmas. Clean. Concrete. Lived. Here's another angle: impeachment and rehabilitation. Defense will impeach with the civil loss. You sued my clients and lost. Fine. Then we rehabilitate with facts that don't care about that docket number, her long service, consistent statements, precise descriptions that match photos, inventories, and chain of custody lists. And if a DNA match to Patsy on the note or to Burke on an item the child used appears, we add the one word jurors listen for: corroboration, not opinion. Convergence. What is more terrible, however, is how public perception is pinned down by slogans. She lost the case. As if that cancels the substance. It doesn't. A defamation dismissal is not a finding that her testimony is false. It is a finding about speech protections. Different lanes. Different laws. The lane that matters here is evidence plus access plus behavior. On that road, she's the map. This isn't about making her a hero. It's about restoring scale. She doesn't solve the case alone. She narrows it. She removes the romance of a shadow slipping through glass. She anchors the story in a kitchen drawer, a laundry habit, a child's pattern of resentment, a mother's urge to control fallout. If lab results ever fix family DNA to the most critical exhibits, her supposed credibility problem becomes a credibility engine. The very lawsuit used to diminish her then signals why she mattered, because her first-hand knowledge threatened a fragile narrative. The civil loss dented her reputation. If science points inward, it will polish it back. The same facts that once weighed her down, proximity, opinions about handwriting, knowledge of placement, will lift her up as the witness who knew the house the way only a worker knows a workplace. And in a case built on ordinary objects turned into silent witnesses, that kind of knowing isn't just helpful. It's decisive. One barrier that has shaped this case from the shadows is the law governing grand jury secrecy. By statute, testimony delivered behind those closed doors cannot be publicly disclosed. For Linda Hoffmann Pugh, that meant her most detailed account, the one where she spoke under oath about what she saw, heard, and suspected, was effectively sealed. She could not walk outside the chorus and repeat it to reporters. She could not publish it later. She was muzzled by law. She once tried to challenge that restriction, pressing for the right to speak openly about what she told jurors. The effort failed. Courts ruled that the shield of secrecy was absolute. That left her with a strange burden. She carried knowledge that could shape the public's understanding of the crime, but she was legally prohibited from sharing it. For critics, this silence made her appear less credible, even though it was imposed by statute, not by choice. Now consider what that silence has concealed. If DNA testing in the future confirms traces belonging to John, Patsy, or Burke, then the grand jury testimony Linda was barred from disclosing may already contain corroboration. Perhaps she described where certain items were stored, who handled them, or what family habits linked directly to the evidence. Yet because of secrecy laws, those details remain locked away. In that light, the law doesn't just protect the integrity of proceedings, it inadvertently shields information that could reinforce the theory of a family-based staging. This is the paradox. On one hand, secrecy is meant to protect investigations. On the other hand, in a case this contested, it hides testimony that might align with modern forensic advances. The result is a kind of enforced doubt. Critics point to Linda's silence as weakness, when in reality it may be strength, words spoken under oath that the public cannot hear, but that could one day match the science. If DNA results conclusively tie family members to the incriminating items, the significance of grand jury secrecy will be reinterpreted. It will be seen not as a neutral procedure, but as a veil that delayed recognition of what one witness had already laid out. In that sense, the law has not just silenced Linda, it has prolonged the mystery, keeping crucial context out of the debate until science can force it back into the open. When you step back from the fragments, the blanket, the flashlight, the ransom letter, what begins to emerge is not just a story about objects, but about the people around them. And in that story, one figure stands out, not because she was powerful or privileged, but because she was present, Linda Hoffmann Pugh. Her value was never in speculation. It was in detail. She was the one folding the sheets when Jonbenet had another accident. She was the one scrubbing when Burke left behind messes too disturbing to dismiss as childish. She was the one who knew which cupboard held the Swiss Army knife, which pad of paper Patsy used, which drawer contained the pens. These details may sound trivial, but they are the connective tissue that links biological evidence to human behavior. Without them, DNA is just numbers. With them, DNA becomes narrative. And that is precisely why Linda became such a dangerous figure, not to the investigation, but to the Ramseys version of events. The book The Death of Innocence painted her as a suspect. The lawsuit she filed, though dismissed, underscored how determined the family was to control perception. Then came the grand jury, where Linda spoke under oath about matters we still cannot hear, because secrecy laws sealed her words away. Add all of this together, and a pattern forms. Whenever Linda threatens the intruder theory, forces move to minimize her voice. If DNA analysis in the present era links family members to the ransom note, the blanket, or the broken brush, then every effort to discredit Linda will look less like coincidence and more like strategy. Her lawsuit will appear not as a baseless attempt at revenge, but as evidence that she knew she was being used as a decoy. Her silencing under secrecy law will appear not as routine procedure, but as the hiding of testimony that may already align with modern forensic science. Think about what she actually offered. She gave investigators the ordinary: holiday stress, marital tension, sibling rivalry. She wasn't chasing shadowy prowlers or inventing elaborate conspiracies. She was describing the household as she lived it. And yet, those plain observations fit seamlessly with the hypothesis of a domestic accident escalating into tragedy. A jealous brother, a panicked mother, a father swept into the cover-up, household items repurposed into a staged scene, a ransom letter written not to demand money, but to redirect suspicion. That's why her testimony matters now more than ever. In the late 1990s, the technology couldn't back her up. The fragments, the hair fragments, the partial profiles, none could be definitively tied. But today, whole genome sequencing, advanced touch DNA analysis, and probabilistic modeling could take the very objects Linda described and finally connect them to the family. If that happens, the jury will not just weigh the numbers. They will ask, who first pointed to these items, and why? And the answer will be Linda. Here's the irony. The very things once used to discredit her civil suit, her silence under secrecy rules, her financial request of Patsy may transform into markers of her credibility. The lawsuit shows she resisted being scapegoated. The secrecy law shows her testimony was considered serious enough to warrant grand jury protection. The money request, once painted as motive, becomes meaningless if DNA ties the evidence to the family instead. What remains is her authenticity as a witness who saw what daily life in that home really looked like. And let's be honest, juries respond to authenticity. They don't want theories floating in the clouds. They want someone to stand in the box and say, I put that knife in that cupboard. I saw Patsy use that pad. I washed that blanket after an accident. They want testimony that makes sense of the forensic record. Not sensational, not dramatic, just lived. Here lies the final point. Without Linda, the intruder theory maintains its mystique. With her, the mystique crumbles. No stranger knew which drawer to open for the pad. No prowler knew which blanket was in the washer. No outsider knew about Burke's feces smearing or his whittling with the red knife. Only someone inside the home or someone cleaning it every week could know those things. That is why her credibility matters. That is why attempts to discredit her are so revealing. And that is why, if DNA ultimately confirms internal involvement, Linda's role will be reevaluated not as peripheral but as central. So where does that leave us? With a paradox. For years, Linda Hoffmann Pugh was treated as marginal, even suspicious. Yet decades later, she may emerge as the most important witness in the entire case. The housekeeper, the one once accused of needing money, could be the person who finally links science, testimony, and staging into a coherent whole. Not because she solved it, but because she saw it, lived it, and told it long before.